So thank you all for coming to this first Bars Digi event in the new series, and thanks to speakers, Mike Tooney, who is going to speak first, will introduce now, and I will disappear.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be with you for this hour and a half. So all three of today's roundtable presentations, Brian Rejack's and my own on Zany Keats, Kate Singer's on gender as zany, zany as gender, and Rebecca Schneider's on humor and resistance in a manuscript at the National Library of Jamaica, have their theoretical basis in the notion of the zany propounded in C.N. Nye's Our Aesthetic Category, Zany, Cute, Interesting, published by Harvard University Press in 2012. For those gathered who've not yet engaged Nye's provocative thinking on the subject, and so that each presentation doesn't have to retread the same theoretical ground, I thought I'd give a brief overview of Nye's take on the zany while focusing on one issue in particular, the question of the applicability of the zany to romantic writing. According to Nye, the zany is about performing as not just artful play, but affective labor. As such, it is a seemingly lighthearted but strikingly vehement aesthetic, one that is ludic yet noticeably stressful. Nye notes that the aesthetic of non-stop acting or doing, that is zaniness, is hot under the collar, hot and bothered, hot to trot. Examples of the zany include Lucille Ball in I Love Lucy and Richard Pryor's performance in the movie The Toy. Nye also notes that so much of serious post-war American literature is zany, including work by the poet John Ashbery and the Flarf poets. Nye points directly to Donald Barthelme's novel Snow White as exemplary of the zany, noting in particular its, as one critic put it, staccato burst of verbal star shells, pinwheel phrases, and cherry bombs of puns and word plays. The zany is a subspecies of the comedic mode. The zany also is an aesthetic for Nye of our time, when work and life, including play, have bled together. For Nye, the zany is explicitly about the politically ambiguous convergence of cultural and occupational performing under the new connectionist spirit of capitalism, the dominant ideology of capitalism that has absorbed and adjusted to the artistic critique of the 1960s, but also the second wave feminist critique of the gender division of labor, by now encouraging workers through a rhetoric of networking to bring their abilities to communicate, socialize, and even play to work. However, for Nye, what is most essential to zaniness is its way of evoking a situation with the potential to cause harm or injury. Post-Fordist zaniness in particular suggests that simply being a productive worker under prevailing conditions, the concomitant casualization and intensification of labor, the creeping extension of the working day, the steady decline of real wages, is to put oneself into an exhausting and precarious situation. Nye states, zaniness seems purely a symptom of the perform or else ideology of late capitalism. Yet for all its spectacular displays of laborious exertion, the activity of zaniness is more often than not destructive. One might even describe it as the dramatization of an anarchic refusal to be productive. Indeed, zaniness can be described as an aesthetic about its own unconvincing nature, given its way of dramatizing the exorbitant amount of energy it needs to expend to make us laugh. For Nye, the zany is a recent phenomenon, particularly post-Fordist and postmodern. The zany, along with the two categories she discusses, the interesting and cute, for all their marginality to aesthetic theory and the genealogies of postmodernism, are the ones in our current repertoire best suited for grasping how aesthetic experience has been transformed by the hyper-commodified, information-saturated, performance-driven conditions of late capitalism. Nye states explicitly that the aesthetic categories in this study refer to basic human competences increasingly encroached on by capitalism over the past half century, affect and emotion in the case of zaniness. But Nye also states repeatedly that the zany has deep historical roots. It has dramatic history in commedia dell'arte. Nye continues, deriving from Commedia dell'arte's stock character of the Zani, an itinerant servant modeled after peasants seeking temporary work in wealthy Venetian households, zaniness has a history that stretches back to the 16th century division of labor and the theater marketplace culture of what is now Italy. But besides or in addition to the relation to Commedia dell'arte, there are other connections with the past. Nye states that the Zani's increasingly despecified relation to working is particularly characteristic of the growing informality of late 20th century post-industrial work, the cultural correlate of the economic casualization of labor. But it also defines the ideal worker of 19th century industrial capitalism described by Marx, the perpetual temp, extra, or odd jobber, itinerant and malleable, for whom all labor is abstract and homogeneous. And frankly, it's hard to not think of the Romantic era when we hear Nye saying something like this: the rise of the weak or trivial aesthetic categories in this study takes place in conjunction with an overarching habitualization of aesthetic novelty, an increasing overlap between the domains of art and theory, and a loss of the long-standing tension between the work of art and the commodity form. If all of this was not taking place in the early 19th century, it certainly was at least nascent then. Allowing for this temporal blur is important for a number of reasons, but key among them is the fact that Nye suggests that the relationship between the zany and gender and class divides becomes particularly close, especially more recently. Nye states, this confusion about the gender of the kind of effective work zaniness indexes, as it increasingly gets done across gender and class divides, is producing mixed but strong emotions in both men and women, which is exactly why gender matters to post-Fordist zaniness in a way that strikingly distinguishes it from earlier versions of this modern aesthetic. In other words, because of the changes in the social location and cultural status of the affective relational work it encodes, the question of gender becomes internal to post-Fordist zaniness. And this new emphasis on gender as a point of uncertainty is exactly what sets contemporary zaniness apart from its earlier incarnations. So, however, while for the most part today's presentations will largely depend on Nye's thinking about the zany, here certainly is one area where the presentations might talk back, and in fact, Kate's presentation will talk back to the theory, suggesting or arguing how crucial gender and class divides were even to the zany, even in the Romantic era. Additionally, another way the presentations may respond to Nye is that while agreeing that, as Nye states, in contrast to the beautiful and the sublime, the zany, along with the interesting and cute, is undeniably trivial and marked by inconsequentiality, and that to aestheticize something is not necessarily to idealize or even revere it. We, of course, are interested to use the aesthetic category of the zany to carefully attend to works not often carefully attended to. Nye states that in addition to being emergent gestalt-like qualities that we can attribute to objects of various scales, vernacular aesthetic categories are widely distributed across time and space, locatable in superstructural crannies too copious and diverse to enumerate. We're just about to slip into a few of those many crannies to consider instances of the zany in the Romantic era. As we do, we hope you'll be thinking about other places the zany emerges in the early 19th century, and perhaps also about the way that the zany manifests itself in our own effective work and play as scholars, teachers, and students of Romanticism. And with that, we'll start our first official presentation.
I'm sorry, Mike, I forgot to show this last.
Sure, yeah, great.
Bad. So on to Zany Keats. Mike and I are gonna present this together. It's sort of part of something we've been co-writing. So here we are. We begin with a very much non-canonical work by the canonical Keats, The Cap and Bells, also known as The Jealousy, the last major poetic project on which Keats worked before he died. So after briefly introducing the poem, we'll make the case that it is indeed a zany document, both in terms of what it is as a literary work and as a product of Keats's own clear zaniness as an effective laborer toward the end of 1819. So for those who don't know, here's a non-zany summary of the poem's general narrative, consisting of 88 Spenserian stanzas and 2 lines of an 89th. The Cap and Bells tells of the machinations surrounding the nuptials of Emperor Elphanin, ruler of the fairy realm. Against the religious codes of his land, Elphanin favors mortal women, and one in particular, Bertha Pearl of Canterbury, also featured in the Eve of St. Mark. Nonetheless, Elphanin obeys his counselors and sends a contingent to retrieve the unwilling Bellarmine, his betrothed, who is transported to him under the watchful eye of Craftacant, Elphanin's great state spy militant. In the meantime, Elphanin enlists his soothsayer Hum to help the emperor attain Bertha. Hum devises a plan, Elphanin leaves. Shenanigans ensue until the fragment ends with a description of Bellarmine's arrival at a palace without an emperor.
So that's the narrative, but barely. Really, The Cap and Bells is a madcap, frenetic, zany romp filled with deeply strange and silly moments. The performative zany is on display throughout so zany. The performative zany is on display throughout the poem, which is filled with physical comedy. When we first meet him, the soothsayer Hum enters the scene walking downstairs backwards with only one shoe on. No reason is offered for this oddity. And near the end of the fragment, in one of the poem's funniest moments, when amidst the hubbub of the hall, due to the discovery of Emperor Elphanin has fled at the very moment of his betrothed's arrival, a poet chooses this inopportune moment to perform his politico-poetic duties as he rides piggyback, mounted on the court clown's back, swift with spurring heels towards Bellarmine, and close into her face with rhyming clack began a prothalamion.
Mike and I have written an essay that will be published as part of a special issue of European Romantic Review, focused on Keats's 1820 volume, in which we argued that The Cap and Bells could replace Hyperion as the final poem of that volume, and in so doing, smoke, as Keats would say, much of the volume's serious work. The Cap and Bells does its smoking by revealing and making fun of the machinery of poetry, indicating clearly through echoes and reflections how what seems the sophisticated, subtle technology, even of the seemingly serious, mature poems of the 1820 volume, still is a trick of spinning certain silly gears. Charles Brown would later note that Keats began his work on The Cap and Bells without framing laws in mind for the supernatural. Richard Monckton Milnes includes a note attributed to Brown, indicating as much when publishing the fragment in full for the first time. You can see here it says, "It was begun without a plan and without any prescribed laws for the supernatural machinery." Brown found the lack of plan worrying, but Keats reassured him that all the startling contradictions would be harmonized later on.
Brian and I think, though, that Keats likely thought nothing really needed to be fixed, that in fact The Cap and Bells really is about having fun with framing laws, especially with respect to matters of scale and, in fact, machinery, especially the machinery of transport, whether actual physical transportation or the transports of poetry. Keats won't harmonize everything at all. Rather, he'll put things into zany play.
As it involves very human interactions, The Cap and Bells is replete with transgressions of scale. If the size of bodies is one matter, how to move bodies, and in this case, the semi-ethereal bodies of fairies, is another. These issues often seem to arise due to the somewhat awkward fact that fairies have both feet and wings. Craftacant is described as a running, lying, flying footman. Eben is swift of look and foot and wing. And how all of this works is always fodder for fun.
And of course, Posey also has feet and wishes to transport readers on its viewless wings. Keats will capitalize on the zaniness of this. In fact, the connection between transport and clacking poetry in the Cap and Bells reaches an apotheosis when Hum witnesses the arrival of the train that is bringing Bellarmine to the castle. Seeing this conveyance, Hum is moved to ejaculate, "The morning's very fine, uncommonly. See, past the skirts of yon white cloud they go, tinging it with soft crimsons. Now below the sable-pointed heads of firs and pines they dip, move on, and with them moves a glow along the forest side. Now amber lines reach the hilltop, and now throughout the valley shines."
Hum's effusion on the occasion of seeing this transport and his conveyance of his mood in this manner leads Elphinnon to recognize it as poetry. The emperor exclaims, "Why, Hum, you're getting quite poetical. Those nows you've managed in a special style." To which Hum replies, "If ever you have leisure, sire, you shall see scraps of mine will make it worth your while. Titbits for Phoebus, yet you well may smile."
Oh, I'm smiling. Keats obviously pokes fun with at Huntian verse here. Hum's nows most obviously bring to mind the Huntian tendency that would achieve its peak in Hunt's Indicator essay, a now descriptive of a hot day. But we also should note that Keats uses this technique, the technique of listing a series of nows, also at the ends of Ode to a Nightingale and to Autumn. It's just that in those poems, at the ends of those poems, Keats simply lets those nows be silent.
So Keats is being zany, but zaniness is doing the work of smoking his earlier work. Of course, in this way, it's also repurposing and recycling it. If not quite redeeming, Keats also is trying to see how much he can get out of some of his gestures. We use these economic words intentionally, as this is about money. Gad, he's obliged to stick to business, we're told of Hum and the expense of materials for his magic making. Poetry too requires diligent work, even if it is at times indolent and or delicious. Mm-hmm. But as he does in a more serious register in poems like The Fall of Hyperion, Keats questions the worth of poetic labor through his varied instances of smoking his own aesthetic, and by placing imaginative work alongside seemingly more practical endeavors like commerce and physical infrastructure. The first published part of the Cap and Bells was a passage about carriage travel, printed by Hunt in the Indicator in 1820. And there's also this fascinating reflection on the gas lamps used to bring illumination to fairyland. These diligent retail dealers who bring illumination to darkness through stealthy powers that flare in many a brilliant form sure sound an awful lot like poets.
Labor, money, and poetry had always been closely intertwined for Keats, but especially so towards the end of 1819, when beginning work on the Cap and Bells. Although Charles Brown would recall that Keats took on the new poem chiefly for amusement and as a relaxation, there are plenty of ways that anxieties around money and labor animate the work. So first, it's worth noting, pointing out that in late 1819, that was a particularly financial precarious moment for Keats. One potential financial solution that Keats was entertaining at the time was making a go of writing for periodical magazines. As we can see from how Keats writes about his poetic labors up to that point, he views what he has accomplished before the end of 1819 as not quite diligent enough. He's been merely feeding upon hopes, and now to multiple correspondents, Keats insists that he's going to get down to some real work.
Of course, Keats does not end up writing any articles for the Edinburgh Review or for any other periodicals, but he wasn't exactly a dead lump either, how he poses himself to both Brown and Dilke. Keats does publish a third book, and he puts in enough work on the Cap and Bells to produce almost 800 lines of verse. So we'll conclude then by suggesting that the combination of Zany humor, fairyland romance, and concerns around poetic labor in the Cap and Bells is a fitting move for Keats, even though the fragment has typically been treated as an aberration. Turns out that at many points in Keats's career, as much as fairylands are forlorn for Keats, they are also spaces of the zany. So this letter comes from May 1817, 2 months after the publication of Keats's first book, just a few weeks into the test of invention that became Endymion, a labor immense indeed, to borrow the phrase Keats uses to playfully describe the prospect of continuing with the Cap and Bells. And in this letter, Keats is faced with the embarrassing task of thanking his publishers for a loan they've provided to underwrite his future work. The letter unfolds frenetically right from the start. Yes, one more so zany. And in the space of a page, Keats has created an entire outline of mock romantic allegory of debt in which valiant knights must fend off the spring-headed hydra, the dun, with the banknote of faith and the cash of salvation. Despite temporarily arming himself with such weapons, Keats recognizes the persistence of this debt monster, casting it as a never-ending, still beginning sort of a body. This zany threat demands a zany response, and the opening of Keats's letter is surely that. But as soon as he leaves this allegory, Keats dwells on how, after having worked hard on Endymion for weeks, he now finds himself stuck. And this is Keats the poet at work, an overwrought brain imagining a romantic struggle against debt, even as the constant poetic productivity needed to head off the relentless hydra has rendered further work temporarily impossible. And with that, Mike and I will pause our work for the moment and turn things over to Kate.
Thank you so much, Brian and Mike, for the zaniest. And I also wanted to thank all of the organizers for all of your work and always getting us together to talk. Let's see. Does that look all right? All right. So I want to start actually, not in the Romantic period, but with a clip from a current comic zany, Tig Notaro, to think about a question that Sian Nye raises at the start of her chapter on the zany, when she says, and what might gender have to do with all of this? Tig, a gay comedian well known for her open discussion of her double mastectomy, her queer family, and her resemblance to Tom Cruise and other instances of being mistaken for a man, points the way back, I think, to a different history of the zany in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, one which has a different relation to gender. I'm going to try to do my own zany historicism to link Tig to Charlotte Shark's gender antics and to Anne Lister's sexual shenanigans, to help us think a bit about how their humorous mixture of gender play and sexual labor might help us think about gender as itself a zany, if not the zany, born of the Romantic period, in the crevasse of the one-sex and two-sex models to make ambiguous both gender and sexuality. So first, some Tig to get our brains moving through gender performances that are both occupational and cultural. Tig joined the cast of Star Trek Discovery for season 2 as an engineer. Here's Tig joking around on late night TV about not knowing what she's doing. One thing that she does not mention that seems important context here is that in the show, she becomes part of a queer family, joining a Gail May couple whom she likes to spar with and their adopted non-binary teenager. Okay, so let me switch to
you, Tig Notaro, you are in the next season of Star Trek Discovery. That's correct. Which is huge. I was thinking, oh, I can't wait to see what they do with a dig, some kind of, it's gonna be amazing.
Very Star
And then it's literally this. That's it. That's
just
no. Hey, it's just a jacket.
Huh?
You look great. That's
Thank
top.
you,
I think
Bo.
you look space. I do. You look awesome. It is amazing.
I'm a married woman.
How was this experience for you?
It's a blast, and the cast, the producers, writers, everyone's so nice. Very patient with me. I'm terrible at it though.
Why? In what way?
Well, James, I don't know what I'm saying. It's the, science fiction-y Star Trek stuff.
Oh, the dialogue, you mean?
Yeah, the
Right.
dialogue, right.
So what, you can't remember the lines, or you just can't say? What
It's like I spend my time really going over it, and but I can't. I probably shouldn't announce this because CBS might fire me. But
can you remember anything that your character says on the show?
All right. Sorry. So I think that's enough. Tig, like the Zany, takes on a utility acting job of one of Star Trek's famed engineers who can fix anything just in the nick of time. What seems so zany to me is the way that she both plays an engineer and touts the fact that she has no idea what she's doing. This trope of the doctor or engineer who can fix anything, yet also someone who unfixes gender, and she kind of talks about how she looks like Tom Cruise at the end of this clip, is actually a common trope in the Romantic period, starting with the alleged first female husband narrative, Henry Fielding's salacious pamphlet entitled The Female Husband. With the journalistic verve of Daniel Defoe, who also tried his hand at some cross-dressing narratives in his General Pirates history, Fielding takes a picaresque tale of one Charles Hamilton, who cross-dresses as a man, marrying several times while gaining social status as the doctor. And it's interesting in that narrative that there is like a long swath of that narrative where no pronoun is used, but Hamilton is just the doctor. Charlotte Shark, whose own memoir replays Hamilton's tale, wildly varies her occupational performances, working as a village medicine woman and apothecary, an actress in breeches roles, then cross-dressing as a manservant and a baker, among others, while accidentally romancing women and living allegedly abstinently with at least one. It is somewhat difficult to excerpt a piece from Shark because part of the comedy and drama of the memoir is its picaresque gallivanting through various jobs, genders, and relationships that would garner its complicated status. What is somewhat unique about Shark's narrative as an early trans or gender crossing narrative is that one, we have a first person speaker, the one that shares a kind of doubled celebration and denigration of their own gender crossing, and two, gives an origin story to their zaniness that does not involve extreme adultery or extramarital deviancy on the part of their parents. Rather, Shark entangles her zany with her queer gender performance. She begins this early part of her tale by noting her madness and risibility. So I'm gonna share. And read this quote. So this is a little bit of a long quote I'll read and then talk about. As I have promised to conceal nothing that might raise a laugh, I shall begin with a small specimen of my former madness. When I was but 4 years of age, having even then a passionate fondness for a periwig, I crawled out of bed one summer morning at Twickenham, where my father had part of a house and gardens for the season, and taking it into my small pate, that by dint of a wig and a waistcoat, I should be the perfect representative of my sire, I crept softly into the servants' hall, where I had the night before espied all things in order to perpetrate the happy design I had framed for the next morning's expedition. And Shark goes through like a long discussion of the clothing that they pick up. Being thus accoutred, I began to consider that it would be impossible for me to pass for Mr. Kibber, in girl shoes, therefore took an opportunity to slip out of doors after the gardener, who went to his work, and rolled myself to a dry ditch, which was as deep as I was high, and in this grotesque pygmy state walked up and down the ditch, bowing to all who came by me. But behold, the oddity of my appearance soon assembled a crowd about me, which yielded me no small joy, as I conceived their risibility on this occasion to be marks of approbation, and walked myself into a fever in the happy thought of being taken for the squire. The drollery of my figure rendered it impossible, but assisted by the fondness of both father and mother, to be angry with me. But alas, I was borne off on the footman's shoulders to my shame and disgrace, and forced into my proper habiliments. There's a lot to say about this anecdote. Shark's attempt to mime and inhabit her father's sartorial patronymic, her rolling around in the ditch as a non-human pygmy, the euphoria of crossing genders, and the fevered performance that gives rise to laughter. We could talk about all the things the laughter might represent, as well as how it gets answered by Shark's mother and father subsequently straitjacketing her into the proper habiliments, as if clothes could doctor her back into a cisgender identity or body. Shark, like Hamilton before them, becomes an overactive subject whose cultural and labor performance are intertwined first through gender crossing. Shark's infamy in breeches roles on stage is predated by this fetish for a periwig, a desire not for the phallus itself, but rather the activity and risibility that come with cross-dressing, and one that we might note momentarily involves moving past the human altogether into the pygmy post-human or non-human. Well before Nye's Lucille Ball presents the absolutely ecstatic subject, and that one for the gay community offers an opportunity for drag, Shark is a jack of all trades but master of none, who combines cultural and job performance by ambiguating gender play and labor. Although Nye dips into the commedia dell'arte in her own zany historicism, she rips right past the supposed industrial 19th century to arrive at a post-Fordist capitalism where people laugh at characters incapable of adjusting to new roles and social situations quickly. Her emphasis on the capitalism of mass production occludes the growing popular print press as a theater of labor gender spectacle. And I'm thinking of this genre of female husband or cross-dressing narratives that were all over the papers and pamphlets. Shark makes me wonder how labor and gender reconstitute each other in the Romantic period. They, and the not small number of narratives like theirs, might also help us reconsider how Nye herself uses women's effective labor. For if part of the comic tragedy of the zany is taking on affective and domestic labor within or alongside some form of mass labor, what Nye seems to sketch as a binaristic engulfing or enforcement of women's effective labor into male roles, or vice versa. But Shark's performance of taking gender on and off as a form of non-binary identification suggests that gender is a zany performance itself. And I would just say, I didn't have room to talk about this, but I am making an argument of identification that I think comes through the self-reflection of the humor that she's using here. There's a lot more to say here about gender, and I hope we can talk about it a little bit in the chat. But I want to turn to think gender in tandem with sexuality because of the way the two are often segregated but intertwined in the Romantic period. If there is any maniacal activity that can also be productively impotent and incompetent, it is surely the pursuit of sexual intercourse, especially queer sexual intercourse, as a performance that demands a willing and participatory audience, even if oneself, but that can quickly become bored or boring. Byron and his Don Juan are surely the most infamous sexual zanies of the period, flexible especially in their bisexual orientation. But Anne Lister's life before she becomes a female husband to Anne Wallace presents an interesting case of a sexual zany. Often using the word queer, Q-U-E-R-E, to indicate both others' feelings about a non-normative sexual desire, and also used to talk about her father's ill management of his estate. Anne thinks about labor and sexual labor in tandem. She lives with her uncle in a liminal state of dependence where she frequently gallivants around the Halifax region, her inveterate activity, the pursuit of various amours with a number of women. In her diary, she sometimes fantasizes about taking Caroline Greenwood into the shed and being connected with her, and connected is one of Anne's euphemisms for sexual intercourse. Supposing myself in men's clothes and having a penis, though nothing more. And sometimes she talks with Marianne, her true love, long lost to Marianne's marriage, about her masculine form. Sometimes she pursues the partially insipid but mannered Miss Brown, and sometimes the combustibly passionate but dry as a stick Isabella. She sometimes feels herself disgusting in these travails, and sometimes argues quite strenuously as to the biblical illegality of sodomy in contrast to the other that was certainly not named and so not forbidden of lesbian or queer sex. Lister's regional mobility offers a picture of the labor of queer sexuality as itself zany. It must be argued as unforbidden, even as it is hidden within female friendships, within ephemeral encounters, or Lister's own fantasies. Her diary itself was encoded with a code made up of Greek, math, and alphanumeric symbols. Her female objects are as various as Anne's varied taking up of masculine form, but not manners, and her pursuit of multiple objects is itself a zany of Lacanian desire that cannot have her maid Marian, a legal wife, or, until she later inherits her uncle's estate, a stable domicile. Her queer desire, like Shark's gender performance, inherently entangles productive and non-reproductive labor, skirts being pathologized as madness, while gets off on the frequent and pleasurable activity of its multiple pursuits. What if it is not binary gender that has to do with the zany, but something other? What if the proliferation of journalistic narratives and life writing, even more than the novel as popular entertainment, offers a romantic zany? This risible madness would then be tied not to a capitalistic Fordham, but rather to the engineered labor of gender and sexual performance, which always entails not knowing what you are doing it inveterately anyway, and projecting that as an engineering of ambiguity, or an ambiguous engineering through a growing media landscape. Thank you. And I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to share screen here. There. All right, so the bullet points that I'll be speaking from, as well as the slides, are shared in a Google folder that was posted in chat earlier. If you joined late and would like to request that, maybe just send a message to, I think Brian has that. So I'm Rebecca Schneider. I'm joining you this morning, my time, from Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. And my institution has a tradition of giving a land acknowledgement to honor and recognize the original land stewards, as well as those who continue to inhabit and connect with the land our institution occupies. And so I just wanted to take a second to recognize the Jicarilla Apache, the various Pueblos of New Mexico, the Nuchu Ute, the Hopi Sonome, and the Dene Navajo nations. Also, my thanks go to the organizers who, over the last year and a half of isolation and loneliness, have made these spaces of community for us. And it's always great to be in conversation with you, Brian, Mike, and Kate. I am very excited to share a couple of thoughts with y'all from another manuscript item. This is the Omnibus, or Jamaican Scrapbook, a thing of shreds and patches. It is possibly written in multiple hands. You'll see some examples here in a second, from the years 1824 to 1831. This is an item held at the National Library of Jamaica, and I just wanted to give a shout out in my super appreciation to Mr. Adolphus DePass, Miss Andrine Tyrell, and Miss Drusilla Grant. They really came through in a timely manner to get me scans of some of the pages you'll see here in a second. So throughout this manuscript, it's over 300 pages long. There are passages from several authors that those in the audience should know well. We'll see an epigraph from Gray here in a second, possibly a zany Gray. I'll leave you to decide that. There's some commentary on public figures. There's some attempts to record vernacular speech. There's many anecdotes and secondhand observations of just day-to-day life. And this question of humor, I think, is the question of the hour, specifically routed through the zany. So to the extent that this omnibus has been taken up by scholarly attention, you can see on the far right, the Journal of the Institute of Jamaica, their second issue back in 1892, examined a dramatic fragment. And then moving to the left, forward in time, about 100 years later, B.W. Hickman, pretty preeminent scholar of Caribbean history, longtime scholar at the University of the West Indies in Kingston. He examined this manuscript, had some things to say about a long poem titled Jamaica, and then Vincent Brown quoted Hickman and had a few other things to say about this poem. So even these generic pieces from the omnibus, from the scrapbook, are pretty much more in line with classic Romantic era texts that we would have in our classrooms, in our syllabuses, in our scholarship. And so I want to maybe take a hard turn away from that. And the two objects that I want to spend some time thinking about, whether or not they're zany, they're definitely not sublime or beautiful to the extent that we typically maybe operate in those aesthetic categories within our period. Again, just kind of a footnote here before looking at some of these pages, some of these images, and thinking about the two stories I've selected for our conversation today. Jack Jingle, maybe someone in the audience knows more than me, but as far as I can tell, it's an English nursery rhyme reference. Why Jack Jingle is the pseudonym chosen by this author or these authors, I have no clear speculation on that. So I wanted to give you some images to look at before talking through the two stories I've selected. You can see here, there's a page on the left it's page 134. The other page is in the 220s. There's very little blank space. So the little vignette longevity is an observation from real life. It's an anecdote from real life. It takes up half a page. The poem Liberty on the second page there begins and then concludes on the next page. Here's the epigraph from Gray. This is the ignorance is bliss. No more where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. And this is the epigraph to a story titled The Negro Saturday Night. And it begins at the top of that page, concludes over there on the second page. And this is page 341 and 342. Here's just a quick example of some of the kind of paleographic differences. This is not a kind of a crucial piece of my argument today, but it is interesting to think about the various hands that this manuscript might have passed through and the various goals and agendas that the authors might have taken up in their compositions in this piece. So again, in terms of the possibly different hands, the different genres that are represented in this piece, the different objectives, whether there was an intention to publish or not. There's even fingerprints that you can see. This is a bit of a zoomed in image, but all right. So for the kind of second half of the remarks I prepared, I want to summarize the two stories I've selected for you. I'll do that first. The first one's titled A Mare's Nest. The second one is titled Jamaica Lions. And then I want to flag two ways that I see what is now a really well-documented mode of enslaved resistance cropping up in these stories, and then circle back to what Nye's what Nye's proposition of the zany might have to say about the potential humor, the potential affective labor that's going on in both of these tales. I don't consider either of these beautiful or sublime in terms of those aesthetic categories, and I maybe don't even consider these zany. They're definitely subversive to the extent that I would categorize this aesthetic work and the affective labor described in these stories as zany. It's maybe not that it's not zany, but maybe that Nye's zany is not expansive enough. And so in my work, anytime I am thinking about situating archival work within Romanticism, I kind of have this twofold objective. On the one hand, it's finding methods to bring new objects into our conversation, but also being able to see old objects in new ways. And so Nye's provocation to think about the zany as a way beyond the sublime and the beautiful, I do want to take up that provocation here. That rests well with me. And then maybe the zany is perhaps not expansive enough, especially around labor. So I'll say more about that in a second. So here are the summaries. So A Mare's Nest features an enslaved person named Quashie, who is accosted by an enslaver. Quashie is a bit away from any plantation. He is the enslaver demands to know why Quashie is where he is. Quashie says, I'm looking for a lost horse. It's a gray mare. I'm trying to find this gray mare. The enslaver demands, like, have you looked here? Have you looked there? Where have you looked? Wants Quashie to give an account for why he is away from the plantation. Eventually, the enslaver suggests, and this takes up no more than a page. Eventually, the enslaver suggests that Quashie climb a tree and look at a nest. Quashie resists this logic at first, and the enslaver retorts that if you've looked all the places you expect to see a horse, you would have found it by now, or it wouldn't have been lost in the first place. So Quashie relents. Quashie climbs the tree, looks in the nest, shouts back down, I found the horse. The enslaver, who's on horseback himself, rides away. And the reader is left to realize that Quashie has not found the mare in the nest at all. The mare was never going to be in the nest, but upon climbing the tree, Quashie can then see the mare in the next clearing over. In Jamaica Lions, we also have a figure, an enslaved subject named Quashie, not necessarily the same Quashie. Quashie would have been kind of a stereotypical slave name that the composers of this manuscript, composer or composers, could have reached for. So this Quashie is asked by his enslaver, how do I look? So the enslaver is a newly minted militia officer in his regimentals. Quashie says, oh, master, you look like a bold lion. The enslaver retorts, when, Quashie, have you ever seen a lion? Tell me more. What does a lion look like, and how do I look like a lion? Quashie proceeds to describe an animal that's not at all a lion, but in fact a donkey, concluding with the 4 words, ee-aw, ee-aw. So in the process of this short story, Quashie has now called his enslaver an ass, and that's sort of the punchline of this one. All right, so as promised, there are at least 2 really well-documented modes of enslaved resistance that I see kind of undergirding the potential humor or the subversion of the zany, if we want to think about it in those terms. On the one hand, the work slowdown. So Quashie in a mare's nest has absconded from the neighboring plantation, the plantation where he is enslaved, has to give an account to why, has to give a reason that would be legitimate to the enslaver as to why he is where he is, supposedly looking for this lost horse. And then also the absconding from the plantation, and also the work slowdown in terms of how slowly has Quashie actually been looking for this horse? Is this a method that Quashie has employed to become more of a master of his own time and his own body, if at least momentarily? And so the work slowdown is a well-documented mode of enslaved resistance. In Jamaica Lions, the feigned ignorance and the intentional misunderstanding, which I think we can also see in A Mare's Nest. And so Quashie in Jamaica Lions perhaps is well aware of the difference between a lion and a donkey, perhaps not. So the enslaver in this story, kind of believes the lack of intelligence in Quashie, and so the offense is maybe not taken. So that's one possible way to read this, whereas Quashie is being pretty intentional in calling the enslaver an ass or a donkey, not a lion. But anyway, the feigned ignorance, the intentional misunderstanding, again, another well-documented mode of resistance. So back to Nye. Of course, there's zany language here. There are puns, there is wordplay, there is the performative utterance of the donkey sound, the ee-aw, ee-aw. There is also evidence of this erosion in the distinction between playing and working. However, I think I really want to pump the brakes on that a little bit, because in contrast with like the post-Fordist imagining of play and work and labor, I don't feel like that's precisely applicable to how work and labor are defined within a plantation economy, within a slave society. And so that's kind of where I'm thinking that maybe this category of the zany is not expansive enough, because the labor and the work that's accounted for in Nye's consideration, I'm pretty resistant to mapping that as like a one-to-one correlation to the way labor and work might be defined in a plantation society. Nye also talks about the laborer as this disempowered mimic who invites the contempt and laughter of the viewer. And I can see the enslaver and the enslaved in both of these stories occupying that role. So in the Mare's Tale, this Quashie becomes this mimic for the directions or the orders of the enslaver. Look there, climb that tree, which on one level is inviting, I guess, the laughter of the enslaver in this moment as he rides off. But the story is not over. The story ends when we as the reader see Kwashi almost have the last laugh. But again, the author of this piece, a presumably white Jamaican, possibly an enslaver, is the person framing this narrative. And so is that the subject, is the speaker, is the author of this piece getting the last laugh above and beyond Kwashi's last laugh? So in conclusion, if these are not, the zany allows us to think beyond the sublime and the beautiful. So the zany as aesthetic category allows manuscript text like this to be brought into conversation within our Romantic period. But if it is zany, I'm thinking it's a subversion of the zany. The so-called disempowered mimic, so Kwashi, laughs because the enslaver cannot fathom that Kwashi is doing anything other than work. So I think that's the end of my prepared remarks. I'm really looking forward to the conversation we all get to have together. And thanks for giving me a chance to talk about an object that I've been fascinated with since 2016. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Kate and Mike, and everyone here in attendance. We're excited to have some conversation, and you can start putting questions in the chat or raising hands if you have questions you want to ask of us. To start off, though, we'll kind of raise a couple things that the four of us, had in mind as we were putting these different pieces together and thinking about this panel. And I think, one of the big issues, as Mike mentioned in his intro, and as Kate discussed in her piece and Rebecca as well, is, to what extent we, or how we engage with Nye's historicism of the zany, and how we might think about what it means to expand into other periods, and think about how this concept plays out in different moments, different sort of economic and social formations. And the other thing I wanted to just briefly raise is a point that we ended up cutting out of Mike's intro, but I think is an important one too, and especially given what Rebecca was just talking about, which is Nye says essentially that the figure of the zany, part of the aesthetic of the zany, is resisting identification or empathy or sympathy. And of course, that term sympathy especially is so crucial for thinking about aesthetics in the 18th and 19th centuries, and at other times as well. But I think, there are maybe some ways in broadening out the sort of historical understanding of this concept of the zany that can offer maybe some different accounts of that question of sympathy, empathy, identification, etc. So if any of the panelists want to address any of those, we've also started to get a couple questions in the chat. So I'll stop.
Yeah, if it's okay, let's come back to. We've got a great question from Devin, but if it's okay, I'm very interested in hearing. Sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Kate, but in particular, the issue of the sympathy, right? No sympathy for the zany, right? I mean, that this interesting thing that the zany is so kind of, right? We kind of almost overly identify with it, that we go beyond like it's too much, we can't sympathize. But I read the accounts that you shared, right, from Chark and then like Lister especially, and it's kind of like those are sympathy producing like there's something about that zany where I kind of go like, oh right, oh maybe I'm just too zany, right? But I feel some sympathy being produced. What did you reflect on that at all? The role that sympathy does or doesn't play, kind of, or is generated by those accounts?
I mean, yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I guess I mean, I think there are a few ways to answer it. I think I would first say that I think like individual anecdotes, and in particular that anecdote I read by Shark is sympathetic, because I think, and my students always kind of get attached to that, because it is this moment of this kind of originary moment of gender crossing that's like about gender euphoria that is then closed down. And so I think it's almost like there is this like there's this like whole alternative, or like, you know, to use like a Saidiya Hartman concept, there is like a critical fabulation that you could take from that one moment and like trace a totally different memoir or history. But then Shark's narrative, and this is where I was trying to like gesture towards the ways that it's really hard to excerpt, in the same ways that Lister's journals are hard to excerpt, because I mean, it's like excessively picaresque. Like, it's just like one account after another, and Shark gets into like so many like awkward, weird situations. And it's also written without, I mean, it's like at that moment in the 18th century where you're starting to get like a little bit of like internal subjectivity, but not a ton. So that like, it's like they're making all of these decisions or kind of crossing and uncrossing their gender, and you don't really know why. And it's like, it's overwhelming. And it also, in a certain way, resists our ability to ascribe a particular like psychomorphology or like psychopathology to the gender crossing. And so in that way, I think it does resist a certain kind of, I don't know if it's sympathy, because I don't think like Fielding, I don't think he had a ton of sympathy for Charles Hamilton, but it does resist a kind of like narrativization that allows you to say like why, or to pathologize. And even Fielding's own narrative like has moments that do that. So I would say, like, I think that there is this technique that is really attempting to like jerk us out of the sympathetic mode, because of the limitations of that. And then I would say maybe it gestures more towards like a Hartmanian like confabulation, where it makes us our own zany storytellers, because you're like, well, why did Shark do this? And then there are like 100 reasons or 100 different narratives you could spool from that. And I would also say, I think like it kind of puts us into a mode of affect, right? Where there is a certain kind of like energy that's circulated, but it can't be it can't be like narrated, or it can't be boiled down into like one emotion. And I think that is kind of resistive also. So I think that's what I would like say initially. And I'm sure we could also talk about the way that like that, or I would be interested to hear Rebecca talk about the way that might work in terms of like a cross-racial context.
Yeah, Rebecca, if it's okay, why don't we use that as kind of an invitation for you perhaps to think about that? And then there's a question from Devin as well, or a request to have you perhaps say some more about why Nye's categories are complicated and possibly don't map onto plantation economies, right? So I mean, in part what we're talking about here are kind of, Nye is a certainly complex version of the zany, but what we're discovering here is when you look at these particulars, everything gets vastly more complex. Surprise, surprise, right? But Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind reflecting a bit on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions and thanks for the setup there. Hi, Devin. So with the archival research, specifically the research based in a plantation society, a slave society, plantation economies, I feel pulled in two directions, at least two directions. On the one hand, there's the impulse to make legible within literary studies and Romanticism just the incredible narratives and the records of living life, of personhood, of agency and resistance, right? And so finding ways to talk about archival fragments within existing aesthetic modes, existing approaches and methods of literary critique, right? So that's like the one direction I feel pulled in. It's like how to make Romanticism more expansive, more representative of the lives lived within this period. Not to mention Romanticism falls at the height of the transatlantic slave trade in terms of like this kind of geopolitical, economic, these impulses. On the other hand, the way that my work is most interested in these moments of resistance I also feel pulled in the direction to acknowledge that resistance, like by definition, like resists the ability to know, particularly in like a scholarly apparatus, particularly through texts and textual analysis. And so trying to hold space for the capacity of agents to not be their intentions, their aspirations to not be known by texts or by scholarship. Devin, I had to look back up how Nye defines the cute and the interesting, the merely interesting, right? So just to flag here, the cute, as Nye defines it, is this aesthetic, one way that she defines it is this aestheticization of the powerless or powerlessness. And so maybe that fits better thinking about, I don't know, like these thoughts are like super preliminary. I'm also pretty new to Nye's work in general. So thanks to Mike and Brian for inviting me to think in these ways. The interesting then is the experience of feeling something about an object without being able to explain it. So I think that connects a little bit better to some of the remarks I was just making. But I don't think I have a definitive answer to your question. I really appreciate it though, how these other categories, the aestheticization of the powerlessness, that is the cute, and then the an experience of feeling something about an object without being able to explain it, that's like the merely interesting. I'll pass the baton on to some of my other roundtablers, my fellow zanies.
So I love this question. That's so there are some great questions kind of lining up here, but this from Tom Marshall, who kind of is asking us to think out loud a bit about the Zanian relationship to kind of the kind of more classically romantic notion of play, but noticing that play kind of gets so easily co-opted, great idea, kind of in remarkably unplayful, formal, earnestly aesthetic functions. So trying to think a little bit about zaniness as kind of resistant to appropriation. Great question. If it's okay, I'd like to take that for a moment. It actually is kind of part of it's one of my concerns about Brian's and my own work with the Cap and Bells. One of the ways that the Cap and Bells is so kind of a privileged text is because nobody really wants to deal with it, right? It hasn't been appropriated. It's sitting there like some strange object that a few people have worked with, but not many at all. And so I do worry that actually Brian's and my approach is right. It is the Cap and Bells is truly just madcap, strange, weird, and right. One of the things though that we're ending up doing is kind of showing how that still kind of fits into the Keatsian system a little bit. Like we're kind of appropriating it, like trying to bring it back into the conversation and making it. So I do. So I appreciate what you're saying, Tom, and kind of saying like the zany is great because it might not allow for things to be too easily appropriated. But then I'd point to Brian's and my own work and say like, actually, that's kind of exactly what we're doing. Brian, save us.
Wow, how you gonna play me like that? Speaking of play, well, actually, I was thinking in response to Tom's question, I was thinking about the fancy as a kind of related category, right? And I'm thinking of Jeffrey Robinson's book on the fancy, and I think with Keats, it's like, play does have a tendency to turn into this, zany sort of compulsive, version of labor. And I guess I'm thinking about like in the letters, especially how often I feel like when I write my emails, I'm always thinking about Keats's letters, because Keats and I are both always beginning emails or letters with basically some version of, sorry, I'm so behind getting back to you, right? Like there are so many times, and it's not unique to Keats, right? That's something you find in other correspondence, that apology for being behindhand with one's correspondence and all that. But that's often when Keats gets playful, right? It's like playfulness that's kind of rooted in that anxiety about having this overwrought brain. And, you know, when Keats is being zany in his letters, I think it's often from kind of the fatigue of labor. And so I guess I'm just thinking about the fancy maybe as a way to navigate between play and labor. And I don't, it's not very
no, I love
thoughts,
right.
but,
So one of the things one of the kind of hoped for kind of possibilities of this conversation would be kind of the further identification of some of the kind of places where the zany kind of emerges in Romanticism, and it seems as though we're getting some of those. So I love this idea of kind of the fancy as right as opposed to the imagination. At that fancy has that kind of zany kind of quality to it. And then I'd note that in chat that Amanda made mention of Shelley's Witch of Atlas as a possible zany location. There have been some other kind of Eric mentioned Hazlitt's essay on modern comedy as having some relevance as well. So no pressure to participants here or to those in attendance, but we are interested in kind of hearing more about where people see the zany occurring in romantic phenomena. But yeah, sorry, I didn't want to cut down conversation. I also wanted Matthew asked a great question here too, kind of thinking about zany and performative artifice. Right, so the zany might work against Wordsworthian romantic focus on the natural, but also against smooth classicisms. So, and then this perfect image of the zany, right, the cartoon character building the bridge even as they run over it. Does the zany always surface its own making? Yes.
Well, actually, that idea connects with something I was thinking about in response to Kate's paper, which is, Kate, you know, you talked about the journalistic genres and life writing as opposed to the novel as a place where we might see the zany operating in maybe, more enlightening ways in terms of the framework we're working with here. And I was thinking about periodicals as well as like, I can't think of a zanier place to go for texts in the Romantic period than periodicals in the teens and 20s. Like, and one of the features that you often find there is so much surfacing of its own making. It's like, there's so much self-reflexive play, but often around the labor of producing the media that you're then reading. And so I think, yeah, that question about like mediation, and of course I always am thinking about mediation, but yeah, I think that's maybe a crucial way of historicizing the zany in a little bit different terms than not.
Brian, I see that Eric has a hand up, and I don't know if that means Eric wants to maybe articulate the question again or differently.
Oh, thanks, Rebecca. Well, I mean, this is really stimulating and exciting and fun. So I appreciate, I mean, it's been a great panel. And I put in a bunch of stuff in the chat, but what I wanted to say is totally different, and I think quick. To me, it seems like the primary work that might need to be done is to displace or volatilize spontaneity in romantic aesthetic idioms. Because, I mean, I've said things in the chat about just the structure of Nye's book. I think, I mean, I really admire Nye and try to read her account of the interesting, and I'm doing all this work on Stanley Cavell, and that's where I take it. But in terms of her exempla, like, she finds great stuff, but it's such an endlessly wide field, and she just goes to a specific flag somewhere in that field. And really what you have in her books is an incredible space between. And structurally, I think that book kind of works because, as I said in the chat, it like relegates romanticism to the merely interesting. Well, what does that mean? It means Kantian free play and this wonderful invitation to further conversation, because the interesting is always ... And eventually avant-garde art, I think, is at the end of that, you know, like whatever the art that you just kind of point to and gape. The invitation to conversation that is never really foreclosed, but never really taken up. And the way we use, oh, interesting now, which is pretty flat and pretty sort of perfunctory. So I would just say, to do this work, we have to somehow volatilize spontaneity, because it takes up so much of the space that zaniness needs to have, precisely because zaniness is like in tension with labor and capitalist structure and gender, right? And all this stuff that is wonderful as spontaneity is, spontaneity occludes it.
I mean, I wonder, I mean, thank you for all these awesome points and provocations, Eric. I mean, I kind of wonder if part of the issue is like the quiescence of her archive, because I mean, part of what the zany is it's about the spontaneous, but the spontaneous that is also like always threatened to be mechanized or threatened to be like disciplined by the labor which it is supposed to be doing. But it's also about the violence to the body of overactivity that stretches the body and contorts the body, but also in kind of pleasurable ways. And so, and it's like there's not enough, it's like a little bit like there's not enough darkness in the Nye, which I think goes back to, for me, like the 18th, 19th century, it like goes back to the credit economy and the formation of character and the like super, like you said, volatile, like that word volatile, like I think it's like the volatile production of credit that also kind of produces character and also like produces the impossibility of character. At the same time, you have this like volatile slavery economy that, you know, is distending and disabling bodies at the same time, like making it seem as though this labor is like somehow necessary to like the advancement of like the human race. So I don't know, it's like there's almost like there's not enough like Goth in our accounts of spontaneity that the zany gets at, but I also feel like her, and you know, like I mean, her archive is rich, but it's also in certain ways like quiescent in and of itself. And so I feel like moving in more, even more accessibly zany directions, like in the archive, might uncover some of the grit that I don't know, that we maybe need to look at.
I totally agree with that. Her examples are amazing, but they're canned. And they're meant to be. I mean, the Jim Carrey one from The Mask, I think, ends the zany chapter, doesn't it? It's great, but it's canned. You know, like once you see it, you can just write it in your own mind. I totally agree with what you just said.
Yeah, Mike and I were talking about the Gothic the other day, and that can't remember. We ended up talking about Scooby-Doo as like, you know, the distillation of Gothic as zany. So maybe something more to do there.
You meddling panelists. So I'm reading over Matthew's. Sorry, go ahead. Who's speaking?
Oh, this is Eric. Sorry again. Can I ask, this is just a really brass tacks question. I've not read The Theory of the Gimmick, and I know this isn't a Nye panel, but has anyone read and finished Theory of the Gimmick and wants to just like, you know, give a shot across the bow?
I think Mike
I own it and can't wait to dive into it, but I haven't yet made that dive.
I know, me too. And I was at a previous conference where I made the same mea culpa, and it was like 6 months ago.
Right. Yeah. Well, school started, so that laid waste to those plans. So we'll see. Maybe summer 2022 might be the time. Matthew, I'm just going to look at Matthew's question in chat here. The fancy, have a kind of confidence or assurance that's not quite zany. Yeah, I would. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I think, well, in bringing up the fancy, I was sort of doing so recognizing that it's, I think it is actually in opposition to the zany. But what I was sort of thinking through is like, maybe there's something zany about the fancy at times. And I mean, just Keats's poem, Fancy, right, is very much this, that unrelenting fancy never is at home, or pleasure never is at home, right? And this constant like repetition, seeking after pleasure, it becomes a kind of, yeah, almost like compulsive, laborious pursuit. It's, right, it's like diligence without the indolence or something, I don't know, to use those terms again. But yeah, I think there's, just in terms of, yeah, bringing in the idea of the fancy, I would say that I think it's kind of a counterintuitive idea to link it with the zany, but even so, I think there's maybe ways that it could work, especially through Keats's notion of the fancy.
I mean, could we revisit Mike's question about, like, which I guess also revisits Eric's question a little bit about zany as like a historical or historicist methodology? Because I'm interested in, you know, like, what does it mean for us to think about the Romantic as zany, you know, in addition to like overwriting her chapter on the interesting, like, you know, are we, like, what are we saying if we talk about the Romantic as zany and like, and trace it through these various temporalities? Or like, is the zany itself like a metalepsis or something that kind of like rejiggers like the way we think about, you know, how we're going to historicize aesthetic categories?
I'm thinking about, do you guys know the essay by American 20th century guy who works on addiction? Anyway, there's a critical inquiry essay called Equality and Judgment, and I'll think of the name in a second. Mike Clune. That's why I couldn't think of it, because his name is so close. And basically he points out what I think Nye says, which I think is right. I mean, I think this is true, that the aesthetic is now pervasive, right? But, and this is Clune, decoupled from judgment, right? And so he kind of makes a strong argument against sort of compulsory forms of equalization. Anyway, the aesthetic is pervasive, but judgment has been weakened and dissolved. And I think this is what we're doing, right? Like, I feel like this conversation returns us to the realms, the plurality of realms of the aesthetic. When Nye steals the title of her book from J.L. Austin, let's stop talking about the sublime and the beautiful and get down to the dainty and the dumpy. And so, and that's great, because like, I always worry that line from Austin, which I really like, is misogynistic or just British boys humor or something, and she saves it, she brings it back. But I think what we're talking about is aesthetics that are not hived off from sociability and from obviously bad feelings, and, you know, a reclamation of Kant, because it's not about disinterest, and then go from there. And so I love that phrase, metaleptically rejiggers. Like, it rejiggers this whole stanchioning of how we historicize the aesthetic and how romanticism gets always pinned into a certain position with that, which I'm sure all of us are sick of.
Nice of you to have said sick. I was fearful you were going to say guilty, because a little sick and a little guilty, perhaps.
Well, I betrayed my position. I didn't say guilty, so I betrayed my position.
Mike, I feel like since you initially posed this question, you should be put on the spot to answer it further.
So which one?
I guess the broader question about historicizing the zany and historicizing aesthetics more broadly, and sort of where we might introduce some tension or friction with Nye's account, where we might expand things.
It feels to me as though that's kind of already happening, right? So for me, the most terrifying thing in the past 90 minutes was thinking about Rebecca's account of how the zany just doesn't feel applicable to certain kind of spaces within the kind of historical narrative, like that I find a pretty incredible like an astounding challenge to this kind of system. I think the system holds, but it I don't know, it really contextualizes the system, that this system isn't total, and I would acknowledge this, I would have no problem with this, but it acknowledges how how much context matters, how much historical specificity matters, and then, right, to put plantation economy kind of over and against kind of a more, I don't know what to call it, just kind of a more standard economy, right, if there is an economy outside of plantation economy. But it feels to me as though, so I like that what we're doing is, I just think we're kind of complicated. I think what we've been doing is complicating things, and I think they're all complications in ways that I have a feeling that Nye would appreciate as well. I'm going to continue to kind of think about whether or not I'm interested in the post-Fordist, the connectionist stuff, because frankly, we haven't really even kind of gotten to this, everybody. I mean, the way that we all might feel the zany working in our own crazy 21st century lives, and in terms of what it's like to try to work and think and feel and be connected, but potentially zanily connected with others. So I'm just trying to kind of feel that out. So I appreciate that, because the zany feels applicable to some of what I'm thinking and feeling, but after today's conversation, it feels incredibly applicable to Keats, to other figures from the Romantic era. That's all I've got.
I mean, I would just add, Mike, like, I mean, I was thinking about, like what or economy that like you need for the zany to happen. And so I was interested in like a kind of faux free labor situation. And so it made me think of Equiano, because I mean, if there's anyone who's like zany, I mean, Equiano isn't really involved directly. I mean, he's involved in plantation economy, as everybody is, and as like, you know, the kind of merchant piece of the plantation economy, but he's like zipping all over, allegedly zipping all over the world, and then doing all different sorts of labor. And so, you know, it makes me wonder if part of the zany is about like a kind of like faux post-emancipation or faux like free labor situation. And that's the combination of like play and also like discipline or compulsion, that like you have to have like that piece, you have to have the at least like the idea of freeness in order to have the zaniness. And so I don't know, I think it would be interesting to think about Equiano as a kind of zany figure, or a figure that might like kind of inhabit, but also push back against the zany. I don't know.
John Bugg has an essay on Equiano that I think might be sympathetic with what you're saying, Kate, which I think is super helpful. I mean, what you're saying is super helpful. It was in ELH maybe like 5 or 10 years ago now, but it's about performativity and Equiano's rhetoric, and it seems more labile than most writing on Equiano.
Awesome, thanks, Eric.
If folks in the virtual room are familiar with the John Canoe figure in colonial Jamaica, I think that might be another zany figure that we could add on to. It's like the John Canoe is like the carnivalesque, where the enslaved subject dresses and puts on a plantation house on his head and dances frenetically in mimic of and critique of the planter class. And so there's a lot of good work on the John, I'll type it in chat, the John Canoe.
There's some more kind of great stuff happening in chat here very quickly. I think Matthew Sangster, your kind of comment about just even linking up the zany with class anxieties, I think is incredibly perceptive. Undoubtedly, I think Brian and I are kind of that's in the background of what Brian and I are kind of thinking about. And Matthew Ward, right, this stuff about, right, kind of Keats and how that plays out in his puns. I mean, that's so. I think Brian and I begin to talk about that a little bit in our kind of more well-developed essay, that in fact, frankly, the puns are kind of the things that Keats is kind of, that's what he wants to produce. It's where it gets right, Brown talks about trying to harmonize it all, but Keats was already harmonizing all of his zany labor in puns, right? And as long as he could make the joke work, he seemed to be pretty happy with it and kind of, right, happy to kind of then just traipse along. That was his main goal. It wasn't like he was going to try to sort out some system here. The point was the puns, and the point seemed to have been the humor that he was making along the way.
So I think we've reached the end of our set time. I think the panelist, I'll speak for the other panelists and say, we're happy to sort of linger a little bit if people want to talk further. But I'll just say again, thank you to the organizers of the bar's digital events, and thank you to Rebecca and Kate and Mike for being a part of this panel. And yeah, it's been a very helpful conversation, making sense of what we might do with a kind of zany romanticism. So thank you all, and yeah, take care. Go be zany.
Thanks for a series of wonderful papers, and thank you all attendees for coming. Do come along to further events in the series. The next one, I think, is in 3 weeks. We have our Irish Gothic event, so do come along to that for something spooky before Christmas. But the full series is available on the bar's site. But thanks so much for kicking us off for the new year of digital events with such a sort of provocative and interesting series of papers.